name is John King. I am the urban design critic of the San Francisco Chronicle. I'm kind of like architecture critic, but I think the theme of this is what we're very interested in is how the buildings fit together. So what I'm going to do is try and pick up on the very interesting morning of presentations we had and ask each of the participants a question and then also get a conversation going and then shift to some questions from the audience. We also have the building inspector from San Francisco, Tom Hui, just to add a little bit of a, almost like a real-life check to some of the more remarkable images we've seen. So what I'll do is just start by asking each of you a question, and then we'll go from there. But I want to start with John Ram, the planning director of San Francisco, whose name everybody pronounces differently. So I have no idea if that's the right one or not. It was an interesting thing to me that in the presentation, Fred Clark talked about kind of the notion that we've gone beyond region and style towards more aspirations and people in architecture. Professor Lee talked about kind of the global system and the globalism of skylines. And my question almost is, from the local point of view, the planner in a very politically opinionated city, is that true? Or is there still like an affection that people have to want to see the particularity of a place?
Yes. I think what John, I think what you're getting at is this notion is whether buildings, especially high rises, can be designed of a place and time. And I think it's given technology and given the globalization of the economy and of people, right? I mean, the ability to travel the way we do. It would be hard, to be frank, to pick one of these buildings out and put it in a place void of context and say, where is this building? I mean, and I do think there's a certain amount of globalization that's happening. But I also think there are subtle differences and subtle approaches to design of buildings that do make a difference. I mean, in San Francisco, for example, how the building meets the street is really important. The texture of the street, the character of the street, but also in terms of the skyline, the color of the buildings is very important. San Francisco is a white city, notwithstanding some recent egregious examples that are not. I think generally it's important for us that the buildings be light colored. And as I said earlier, San Francisco feels it's important, for example, that the buildings are part of a form, a larger urban form. Some cities are less concerned about that, and that's fine. But other than, it would be hard beyond that to tell you that certain stylistic characteristics are now present in one city or another. There may be others who feel differently about that, but I think there is a kind of globalization in terms of the way buildings are presented, if you will.
And a question, sorry, I'm fighting a cold. A question for Michael Duncan. You talked a lot about the virtues of collaboration. Here he is, leaning over to look. About the virtues of collaboration, working with engineers, working with structural people. And when we look at the scale of tall buildings, towers, way beyond San Bernardino, at some point, does architecture become purely a responsive art, or is there still the hand of the artist and the creator in driving the form that takes shape, or is it all, let's do this light studies, let's do the wind studies, and then massage the form?
Well, I think that these are often complex buildings, complex problems. I talked a little bit about the idea of CoGenesis, where you try and pull out the best ideas, and you can look at any problem perhaps through a different set of lenses. So a planner may have a point of view that is slightly different than the structural engineer's concerns. And if, in the best projects, if you're able to take these many points of views, and this may be the role of the architect, among other things, and synthesize them into something that is unique, maybe a unique response to a place, a unique response to a given problem. The building's richer for that, and rather than necessarily the single hand coming down and saying, here's my vision, making a collective vision, but that doesn't excuse the architect's role. It may be more complex now, to help to ask the questions, help to provoke the answers, but also to help synthesize them into something that is legible and clear.
Okay. Professor Lee, one thing that we see, I think, in any older big city is the popularity of older brick buildings, just the big floor plates, the big, the very simple manufacturing or warehouse building from the past century or so. And these are buildings that the simplicity makes them very adaptable. They're very resilient in the sense of just the way they get re-inhabited as cities change, different uses. When we look at the large buildings being designed now, you were showing very much designing for environmental conditions. Are these buildings flexible, though, for how the society or the city might be living 50 years from now?
Okay, I need to introduce myself first, since Professor Lee is not here. Actually, I'm the Zheng Dong Wang, also come from the College of Architecture and Urban Planning, and I'm also one of the students from Professor Lee, and now the associate professor in the Stanford University. So I really like to give a lecture here, but we only have one chance to give a lecture. So we made a bargain with the Professor Lee, and he will take the lecture, and I will take the panel discussion. And I need also to appreciate you to give me a chance, give me the young generation a chance to show my face. So actually, my background is about the mixed-use projects, a little bit different from Professor Lee, but I think I can answer this question. So basically, I think maybe we can figure it out maybe by two perspectives. One perspective might be how to say that, is the active way to do that. So maybe most of our architects have the big ambitions to change our world. So maybe around the 1960s, there's a movement happened in Japan, which is the metabolism. I believe most of you have heard of it. So there's one of the very famous architect, a Japanese architect, whose name is the Kishu Kurokawa. He built a capsule tower in Tokyo. So the idea is trying to fix the core tube and to put the different small units on it. And the final result is the winning is he's trying to maybe to change these small units in the future, but the final result is no one changed it. And nowadays it's still there. And the reason I think why that's happening is there's maybe another very big pictures developed by other architects like the Archigrams, the Peter Cooks, the plug-in city, and maybe the workable city. The reason we didn't have that is maybe because the picture is nice, but the result is not that nice. So we need to pay more money to change these things. So maybe that leads me to think, to give you another perspective about maybe the passive way to do that. So then there's a very famous example which located in Hong Kong, which name is the Chongqing Mansions. So basically, it's not a very, very fabulous building, but for these buildings, nowadays this is occupied by the peoples from the 100,000 different countries. And basically it's a luxury apartment in the beginning, but nowadays there are the hotels, retail shops, and some of the small industries. So in these buildings, and a very amazing result is they nowadays they have a very good industry, maybe the business about the mobile phone, especially for the Chinese-made mobile phone. So I was told that maybe the 80% of the South Africa's mobile phone is from that building. So it's very amazing. So maybe it's a very small, tiny buildings, but it have a very good location, and the rent is also very, very low. So it's have a very good chance to become another different time. So that's a way to answer maybe the Aldo Rossi, who have already mentioned in the architecture of the cities. So if he can give us the possibilities and it can go with the city's development, maybe it can happen. And maybe I'm too talkative. So I think maybe from the architect's perspective, maybe I think the SOM have already done very, very good jobs, and maybe the Caesar Palace have already done a lot of very good jobs about the flexibilities, about the arrangement of the spatial of the tall buildings. But I need to add one point. So it's also happening in Hong Kong. So the Hong Kong used to be, especially for the central areas, this place used to be full of the tall buildings. But maybe from 1960s, they are trying to build the elevated sky bridge system to combine all these two tall buildings together. I still remember maybe around 2002 when the project is started from the whole area. So the most of the tall buildings podium have not been opened to the public space yet, and it's very dirty and very, very unpleasant to the public spaces. But when I arrived there 10 years later, all these places are changed. So things for the very good pedestrian areas, all these places are changed into the retails and maybe the small facilities and amenities for the public spaces. So I believe maybe to combine.
So even large buildings are adaptable.
Yeah.
Okay. And a question for Professor Chow. You showed the Ring Cool House image at one point, and from Delirious, New York, and everything. I mean, in the decades before World War II, skyscrapers were this romantic symbol of modern life, and you had songs about them, you had some gorgeous artwork about them. They were very much futurism, and they really were kind of embodying what a lot of people saw as the potential of cities. And I was just wondering, what symbolic role do you feel that today's high-rises play?
Well, I think we've seen a lot of examples of that in the most positive sense. The Transamerica building still sits as a symbol of San Francisco, so you see that icon and then you recognize it as part of the city. So a lot of cities are very concerned with their skyline. They're also seen as symbols of technology. It's not clear to me that technology is always progress, but they tend to say, oh, this is the latest that our technology has given us. My one fear is that, I guess, what I've seen about cities is that what needs to be renewed continually is the sense of what the culture is. And so, in that sense, I don't think we have progress. We have this continual remaking. And so I'm always interested in how our buildings continue to add to that portion of progress.
Thanks. And a question for Fred Clark. Again, you mentioned the idea of kind of moving a bit beyond region toward aspiration and really building, that tall buildings can embody the culture of a place and what people are using. How do you kind of fit those aspirations to the different places you work? I mean, Kelly Clark Kelly works all over the world. To what extent is it elegantly designed, one size fits all, and to what extent is it, how do you kind of bridge the globalization and the local place?
Well, I'll say I think this is one of the hardest subjects to address in a clear way today, John, honestly, because 20 years ago the answer would have been, the history of our cities is fragile and disappearing, and that the best thing that an architect can do is to help repair the fabric, extend the urban fabric, usually with itself. In other words, you take a recognizable piece of San Francisco and you build new to appear to be an extension of the historic fabric. First question is that still a relevant way of going about things? So that's question number one. It was 20 years ago. Is it relevant today? That is really very much up for discussion. So that's issue number one in my mind. Architects, unfortunately today, tend to throw away really good ideas. And we have this urge to move beyond the thing that we were doing 5 or 10 years ago. Why we do that, I really don't know. But we're in the process of throwing away the notion that history and context are relevant to even the largest of buildings. So that's issue number one in my mind. I think it's something we really ought to recognize. Issue number two, which is at the opposite end of the spectrum, is that I think that the simple notion of place needs to be re-examined. I don't think place anymore is simply a physical construct. I think place is cultural, emotional, historical, obviously, physical. San Francisco is certainly a white city, but just simply making every building white is not going to make San Francisco a good place to be. I think San Francisco, in some ways, is the best environment to be examining the question of place. I think place, frankly, has become, again, more about confluences of culture, art, architecture, engineering, values, zeitgeist. In fact, in San Francisco, you can't ignore the impact of the culture of technology on buildings. It doesn't mean that every building has to be the longest span or the tallest or the skinniest. It means that the people who are working in those buildings are looking at them in ways that perhaps have never been looked at before. I will go, this sounds a bit rambling, but let me just talk for one quick footnote. I was asked in a lecture the other day about, it seemed like a dumb question at the time, what's the effect of virtual reality on the future of architecture? Okay, isn't that an interesting question? It's very possible that you really won't need buildings. It's very, very possible that your entire experience, your entire existence, to a generation of people who are younger than even my children, might think buildings are irrelevant. Now, if that's a possibility, I think it's not going to really happen that way, but if you're seeing that kind of pressure on buildings and on designers and what goes into making them, you're obligated to re-examine the notion of place. You're absolutely obligated to re-examine it. Because if you don't, you're going to be designing buildings that by the time they're built are actually irrelevant. So it's a broader philosophical question. It could take a whole afternoon to deal with this. Alcohol might be necessary, but it is a way of looking at buildings that I think we really just simply cannot ignore. One of the things that is the biggest impact, I think Michael would agree, is that architects right now are under tremendous pressure to differentiate their product. Every client wants something new. Every client wants an icon. Cities cannot be just simply made of icons. If every building is an icon, this is going to sound like a Gilbert and Sullivan line. If every building is an icon, then no building is an icon. So what I think is really critical, this is what I loved about Renee's talk, is that it's as important to build foreground buildings and middle ground buildings and background buildings as it is to build icons. You have to have a context for the icon to be iconic. So I think the issue of place, I think the impact of place in regionalism on design has gotten very, very, very complex.
Thanks. And the last question is for Tom Hui, who, like Professor White, was not on the panel, trying to keep up with all this. Is the director of the Department of Building Inspection in San Francisco. And one thing that's real interesting, I think it's a good element to add to this discussion, a day like this, you're shown what the different innovations, technological, seismic, engineering, in different countries at different scales, but especially in America, all that then gets folded back into local building codes that are already set that need to be changed through pretty laborious processes that get involved in politics. Certainly in a city like San Francisco, with the seismic concerns and all. So I'm curious, from the perspective of the local building department, how do you adapt to all these engineering innovations and challenges that keep being put before you?
Good morning, John. Thank you to invite me to join you. Of course, most of you know me a little bit. My name is Tom Boy. I'm Director of Department of Building Inspection. I'm a structural engineer and certified building official. Before that, lots of people ask me, in San Francisco 4 years ago when I took over the job, at that time is only 85 jobs and I count for major project over 5 million, and only about $4 billion construction cost. Up to yesterday is 365 and $12 billion construction cost. I think I'm very lucky. The way I have is I have a teamwork, especially with the senior, staff like Hanson, Gary, and Tom Lee, helping me out on those, all my staff here. And also, some people need to live in the office to do their work too. How to do all this is we have a procedure and policy. San Francisco, so many building codes. For example, we are under the California Building Code 2013, and based on IBC 2012. San Francisco have their own building code also. And besides that, we have more than 100 administration bulletins. Those are part of the building code. And also for doing, helping out the industry for the design, we also have 70 more, those what we call information sheet. Just an interpretation to help out. All those are online, transparent. The designer can look at it. My staff will be doing that. Everybody at the same basis. To deal with the tall building, right now we are super tall now. We call it 1,070 feet for Trans Bay, or what we call Salesforce building. Then we have an AB deal with those tall buildings called AB 83, 84, deal with peer review and also performance-based design. When I was in practice, never talk about performance-based design. We are running Fortran with, those cards.
But it is tricky. What do you do when one of these architects comes in and says, boy, we have this great central core system and we don't need exterior columns and we test it in the computer?
Yeah, also we have another AB to deal with. It's called AB005. It's an alternative method and design. Our staff will review it and then they recommend to me, and then we will go through another AB for the peer review to make sure we need to be open-minded. All the design will be innovated and then new technology come in. I remember, way before we don't have that many base isolation building, but now we have lots. Actually, base isolation idea is from bridges and also from nuclear plant. To deal with it, little bit selfish, little bit. Why not tell you this? In San Francisco, we are responsible for 200,000 buildings. They are new and old. And then actually 60% of them are over 40, 50 years old. That's why, in our department, we have lots of permits, roughly 80,000 permits annually. And then how to deal with all these permits with the staff and everybody work together as a team. And then we create a one-stop permit center in our 5th floor, and then try to get 90% of those permits out in counted by, within 1 or 2 days. Then we can concentrate with our senior staff to do all those peer review, and also the new building, they need to review in-house, because safety is number one, is our concern. And then also there's lots of building code changes. Like anything over 420 feet, they need to have an extra elevator or rescue air, or additional stairs because all this after, we call 911 afterward. We learn all this. I heard also somebody ask about density, how when we build more building and all those. Actually, in San Francisco, we have few of the high-rise, need to demolish because of safety concern due to the redevelopment agency. Geneva Tower, I don't know, John, remember we need to blast that down and then we build the whole thing. We change the environment, to make it more safe. That's why safety is number one our concern. We have a procedure and system. And then also furthermore, anybody have any idea about design, they can come into the office, what we call pre-application meeting. Similar for planning, also have pre-application meeting.
Right.
Then you save some time to do all this ahead of time. Instead of last minute come in and then we say, hey, did you consider this cantilever? Did you look at the dynamic analysis for vertical acceleration? Because I worry about those things will be happening, That's why we are open-minded, but we want to make sure it's safe.
San Francisco is all about process. So I want to ask kind of a question for the general group, which is, and this picks up a little bit on something Fred mentioned, and then also questions like about Hong Kong. I mean, what is the challenge of density, and really probably no American city beyond Lower Manhattan or Midtown, and a little bit of Chicago has this, but how do you have the challenge between the goal of density, putting things together, the desire for individuality, every developer wants something that looks different, and then the city trying to make sense of how it all fits, like at the human quality of life level? I mean, what are the if in fact cities continue to concentrate, if we continue to see the economy driving this, how does this all get sorted out in the 5 or 10 years to come? I look like Michael wanted. Oh, okay.
Fred's telling me I should answer this question. How do we sort it all out? I guess what you're asking is how do we accommodate what are substantially growing densities in all of our cities in ways that are still creating great places, right? Because I agree with Fred. I mean, the term placemaking has become kind of our mantra in these new projects, and I don't. And anytime you kind of latch onto a phrase like that, it becomes a little dangerous because then it tends to become its own thing. But to me, it's all about the relationship between land use and transportation and public space, and the social and cultural issues that go with it. So, it's very important, for example, that we talk about mixed-use development, right? 30% of the people who live in downtown San Francisco walk to work. That's part of the transportation solution, for example. Architecturally, I actually think architecturally we've learned so much about how buildings should meet streets and how buildings should touch the sky that I think we have come a long way in addressing the issues. I think, in my mind, the challenges are more about kind of the social and cultural issues and about infrastructure.
And anyone else here?
Yeah, I think the transportation issue is huge, particularly in the Bay Area. And if you don't solve the transportation, but you solve the density, you sort of create a gridlock. So that seems like a first step in terms of tackling the problem. Make sure you have one before the other. The other piece I think that Renee touched on is that every building needs to be contributed. They need to build the street. The reason people live in the city is partly because they enjoy life on the street. So making that requirement and making the program that fits, that activates the streets is sort of a key part of the design.
Let me just take a projected thought. So much of what you're talking about and so core, so central to your questions are, what's the fundamental responsibility of being an architect? And what responsibility does a person who purports to design these tall buildings have to its city, have to also his client, and also to himself or herself. And I think the responsibility of an architect is really enormous. And I think the bigger the building, the more enormous. And I believe that one of the core responsibilities of an architect, frankly, is to think about the next larger thing. It's a term that Eero Saarinen coined. When you're designing a piece of furniture, when you're designing a chair, you have to think about the room the chair is sitting in. When you're designing a room, you have to think about the house that room exists in. When you design the house, you can think about the neighborhood. And I think that ultimately, and maybe this goes back to training, maybe it goes back to education, but I think ultimately architects, we can't avoid the need to create icons. It's just part of the game today, and when we embrace it, we all embrace it. We're in a great icon race right now. But while we're doing that, we really must be thinking about the larger issues. I mean, what I think one could easily say is that the city is more important than the building, and the building is more important than the architect. And I think that sort of underlying sense of values is what we always need to find within ourselves, regardless of what size building we're doing.
I know architects who would disagree with that last statement.
I had to say it.
I want to ask one last question, and anyone hop in, and then we'll go to questions from the audience. This is kind of a tricky one, but it involves time. And, this is something I kind of, John talked about with just being a planner, how it stretches out. And then we plan for transit, and the idea that you need the critical mass to really spur the transit and everything. But then there's that lag where everyone's complaining about traffic jams, but you still haven't generated the money or anything. There's this constant gap. You see 60s, you talk about the skywalks in Hong Kong and things. You go at one point, they're all a failure. You come back a decade later, they're all a success. But there are going to be people who, before they start, are going to say, we've got to stop this. It's not working. How do you, in an age like ours where everyone wants to make the judgment of the moment and get on Twitter and proclaim something to work or not, how do you kind of make the case, especially with building things as complex as what we've seen today, how do you make the case for the long-term need to wait things out, given all the grief in the meantime? I know that's kind of another essay question, but I'm just curious any thoughts anyone might have. Boy, I think I've stumped it.
Maybe I can try. So, maybe I can also say something to continue the former topic. Actually, I also came from Shanghai. I'm a Shanghainese, and when I'm looking at the Lujiazui CBD areas, so the three mosquitoes, we all like them very much. But when we're looking at these three separate buildings, they are very, very beautiful buildings and very high efficiencies. But when we are looking at these buildings together with the cities, that might be a problem, Especially for the scales on the road in Lujiazui CBD, it's not even for the people and not even for the cars. It's a very big area. So I still remember there's a case study to compare the lower Manhattan Island together with the Lujiazui CBD Island. They have a very similar area and shape. But the height, definitely in Shanghai we have the higher height. But the density and even the FAR, the total FAR is totally different. So if we calculate the FAR for Lujiazui CBD area, it is similar to some low-rise buildings area. I mean, the big picture. So my point is maybe the density is very important, but the connectivity is also very important. So together with the connectivities, we can change the density into the intensity. So that's one of my points. Yes.
I think the idea of time in cities, they're kind of intertwined. The joy of evolution of city is part of what makes the joy of living in a city. Seeing Chelsea evolve in Manhattan, or seeing new districts being created, that's kind of the vitality of the place. So cities expand, maybe they overexpand, maybe they overexert themselves, but they often correct themselves over the long run. So being able to hang in there long enough to watch the evolution is part of the creation of great work of art, which any great city is.
And I guess what I'll just add, John, is that cities were never done. We are never done building them, right? There isn't a point at which we can say, okay, we're done with this with San Francisco. Let's move on to Oakland. Although Mayor Schaff might like that idea. But I do think that, and this may be a kind of a sideways answer to your question. The kind of disinvestment in American cities that occurred in the last half of the 20th century, we're over it, right? And that was, I think, a very short aberration in urban history when you look at 10,000 years of people congregating in cities and densifying. That's been happening for thousands of years, and the only time in human history when we didn't do that was the last half of the 20th century. And we are back to the norm. And I think the notion that our cities are densifying is simply a part of what we've been doing for many, many hundreds and thousands of years. So I think that we have to tell the story better, right, to everyone, including ourselves. And I think that we really have to make sure that we need to think of these issues in cycles in terms of private development versus public infrastructure versus social development and affordable housing. Those things kind of come in waves and they don't always match.
Right.
And I think we have to kind of recognize that and make sure we're continually telling the story in better ways. I think we've been dreadful at telling the stories in our U.S. cities. And I think that we're learning that lesson a little bit, but we have to keep, and part of the problem is that in our lifetimes, at least in my lifetimes and many people here, we haven't experienced this pace of growth in our urban centers. And so we're kind of catching up with telling the story.
And let me get Tom and then down to Renee.
John, hello, yeah. The way I feel the new generation is different than ours. In the old day, we always like to buy a single family home with 4 bedrooms and a big backyard. Nowadays, the new generation, they like to be, home free, and they don't want any yard, and then they want to have condo, and then they want to go to clubbing and partying, It's different than our generation. That's why it's completely different. And then you buy $1 million home in San Francisco, is that affordable or whatever? That's why change. Another couple points I want to, let you know is, besides the transportation, there are a couple issues. We always work with fire department and water department because, I went to some city in China or other places. Flooding is a major concern because with all these, taller and taller building, water, how to get there. And also the water department also may have a concern how to get the water. That's why we have lots of big ordinance, like you said, we have lots of procedure and everything. Trying to help out by doing all those safe, water, by doing an ordinance like just pass to put meter in each, unit, to control it. Because every time when there's a high-rise building, some of them, need to repair and then shut up the whole field floor and then get the water, waste.
And Renee.
It's not usually I sit in a room and I feel like I'm the historian in the room. But I think that this notion of change and how it's embedded in our buildings and our cities, again, changed remarkably in about the 1950s and 60s. If we look at cities and the way that we build buildings, so it goes back to your first question, John, about, one of your earlier questions about the reuse of the industrial buildings. Buildings, urban fabrics, had an ability to hold change, so we can look to cities that have fabrics and buildings that are hundreds of years old, that have managed to take on different uses, new forms, additions. And I think in the 50s and 60s, there was a shift to being efficient about how we designed everything. So we didn't include an additional capacity. It was really about efficiency. And so we started to hit sort of minimum thresholds. Buildings started to fill their whole lot. Structural capacity is meant to hold the particular use that's there. And that still dominates a lot of the way that we think about city design and building design. And I think one of the things that we need to look to for the future is if we imagine that our buildings are also going to last hundreds of years, coming back to saying, is it more than efficiency?
That's the eternal challenge. Let me now go to questions from the audience. Marianna, we'll start in the back here. Oh, as the guy runs over with the microphone.
Hello, my name is Anup Mokha. I'm a structural engineer. I have an observation on John's and Fred's presentation and then a question to both of you. John, it's amazing that the kind of presentation in the thought process you have shown today rarely gets recognized. The fame goes to the architects. I mean, clearly you can see the level of details you guys have to think, and it may take 10, 20 years for your work to take shape, but it does culminate in having iconic signature and landmark structures that, to me, they are the treasures that define the city. And I really have to commend for your work on that. Fred, equally for you, the amount of design process and the thoughts that goes into building this landmark structure is amazing. In the end, you did make a statement that the Salesforce Tower is probably the safest building in town. And as a structural engineer, I would agree with you, but I would like to qualify. Yes, it's safe against collapse, but whether it will be sustainable, functional, I'm not too sure. Let me give you a supporting observation. New Zealand, if you look at New Zealand, it has the highest seismic design code, higher than California for building codes. 2011, only a magnitude 6.3 earthquake, only 6.3. 2 buildings collapsed, more than 2,000 buildings got damaged. Downtown Christchurch, 70% of the buildings are empty. Planning department green tagged the building. People don't want to move in. This is the truth. If you look at the aerial view of pre and post Christchurch earthquake, 30% of the downtown buildings have vanished. So now the question to John and Fred. Does residency sustainability ever factor into your planning and design? Why? The next big earthquake, those treasures will literally turn trash in 20 seconds, and the iconic building standing may not be functioning.
The short answer is yes. I guess it's on. Absolutely. I mean, maybe Tom should probably answer this question more than I, but I will simply point out that I was not in San Francisco during the Loma Prieta quake in '89, but I was in Seattle during the 6.8 in 2001. And Seattle went through that earthquake, and again, the number is somewhat irrelevant. The location of the quake, the depth of the quake, all of that has a factor in this. As many people know. But Seattle went through a 6.8 earthquake in 2001 without one death, and only a handful of unreinforced masonry buildings partially collapsing. I was in the city's 62-story building, which swayed 10 feet at the top of that building, and there was not one crack in that building. So I do believe that we can do this. I think we have. I think the structural engineers in the room have done an extraordinary job of figuring this out. I can't speak to what happened in Christchurch. My sense is that a lot of what happened in Christchurch were older buildings that were not built to current seismic standards. And we certainly have our share of those in the Bay Area. But I think we've come a very long way in addressing this issue and keeping buildings at least safe from collapse in all but the very most severe earthquakes.
Fred, okay, real quick, because I want to get out of questions. We just have a few minutes.
First of all, myself is also a structural engineer. As you know, no building say can be seismic proof. From my experience, one of the building I designed in 1985 for IBM 050, and then the criteria is set by Stanford University, and then they designed the building with X, Y, and Z vertical acceleration, and then we need to, also do an inelastic analysis post over at that time. That building, I feel they are okay because during any substantial earthquake, but of course we don't know the magnitude, like the Japan, not the recent one, the other one is 9.0. That's a substantially high magnitude. But for example, right now we do all the analysis, we have lots of experience now with all the technology we're trying to apply. Should be, sustain, good, seismic event, but nobody can predict what happened next, but we just trying to do our best.
And let's hope we never find out. One or two other real quick questions.
John, do you
Yes.
mind if I clarify one thing? I wasn't really super clear. The level of security I was talking about was the transit center itself, not the tower. The tower is also a very, very safe building, but it's not the place of refuge that I was talking about. In both cases, structurally, the underlying and driving criteria has actually been redundancy. And these are redundancies that are required by the city. The city has a very, very powerful peer review process for anything having to do with structural design. In the tower remains completely intact. I don't remember exactly how many, but several of its big columns disappear for some reason. The transit center is basically three buildings in one. It's that the length of the building is subdivided in three parts. Each of those three parts is base isolated, move independently from each other, and in any of those three parts, several of its largest columns can also disappear for whatever reason, with the building still remaining a fully functional place of refuge. So the very, very good thing is that San Francisco, I think, has some of the very highest standards in the world, in many cases higher than Tokyo's standards, believe it or not. So you're really building extremely safe buildings, and you're using performance design criteria rather than kind of an old-fashioned formulaic process. So you're doing extremely, extremely safe buildings.
And real quick question here.
Hi, I'm Siddharth. I'm a structural engineering student at Stanford. My question is to Mr. Duncan and Mr. Clark. Like, from an architect's perspective, how do you assess the mood of the occupant moving inside the building? That, as in, how do you make him flow in a certain way so that his experience is good, but you have to make him move in a certain way, especially in vertical cities like the tall buildings?
How do you choreograph life without people feeling they're being pulled like a marionette?
Well, I think movement through the building is sort of it's an important part of the way people experience it. So we do choreograph it in many cases. How do you get from the front? How do you see the building? How do you get to the front door? How do you move gracefully to, in the case of tall buildings, some vertical transportation? What is that experience like? I think often providing more than a single experience is part of what enriches it, so that it's not a single track, it's not a single experience. There are complexities in there. There may be choices on how they move. One of the interesting things about these tall buildings, they've got large populations, and you've got a lot of people moving through these spaces potentially. Harnessing that energy and making that interaction, that social interaction that happens either at the base of the building or up to the building is part of the interesting challenge of a tall building. And it can be pretty successful. Giving identity and neighborhoods within a very tall structure, so that in the case of a city you have streets, you have addresses. In the case of a vertical building, you may have vertical addresses. So you may have more than one character, more than one sense of neighborhood. Mixed-use buildings have an even perhaps more complex problem in terms of splitting different users. We may or may not want to mix the different populations together. So there is a lot of choreography, and that is part of kind of the planning process. I think more and more, though, we're seeing what has been in the past a very kind of clear division of office comes in this door, residence comes in this door, never the twain shall meet except down the street. How do they actually harness the energies of both of those population groups in a mixed-use tower to have a more sense of a larger social mixing space or social interaction? So I think there's an evolution going on in design that is about doing those very choreographed movements, but trying to enrich the kind of social experience that happens in a tall, complex building.
Okay, terrific. Listen, thank you all. You got a lot of information this morning. There is now a brief lunch break. I'll hand off the